speaking to us today about how you go from having an internet draft to actually becoming an RFC. But actually, he's going to talk about something far more fundamental than that, but I'll leave that up to him to tell you. Fred has been a chair of the IETF at a very, very seminal time. I mean, of course, I suppose they're all seminal times. He's been with the IETF many, many, many years. And as I think, as I said in an introduction to someone the other day, Fred has forgotten more than a lot of people will ever know. He's currently co-chair of V6 Ops, has at least 10 drafts out that I know of. Could have changed to 12 or 15 by now. He has a wealth of expertise in many, many areas. So we're fortunate enough to have him, so I'm going to turn this over to him now.
So, hi. By the way, we have the RFC editor in the room. I will not make her stand up. That's so that you won't mob her afterwards. Can you tell? She's like, anyhow. But, okay, so question we get asked an awful lot is, okay, so I posted an RFC. How do I get an RFC number? Like, there's a little bit we need to talk about somewhere in between. If you were at Scott Bradner's session in this room in the last hour, I'm going to repeat some of his material, but my focus on that is going to be a little bit different, and just looking at it as a workhorse, a doobie, writing drafts and trying to make the right thing happen. So yeah, we're talking about the journey from internet draft to RFC. There's something very basic to understand in that process, and that is that the job of the IETF is not to write RFCs. What we do is we solve problems. Now, the solution to the problem quite often is documented in an RFC. It's implemented in code. It winds up in somebody's equipment somewhere in some network. But fundamentally, it's not about producing an RFC. As a matter of fact, well, okay, I'll get into that on the next slide. What kinds of documents do we have? Well, we have RFCs and RFCs and RFCs and RFCs of several different categories. But in the IETF, our primary focus is on internet drafts. Internet drafts are discussion documents. They might be white papers, they might be specifications that are being developed, they might be reports of problems, they might be, who knows, they could be a lot of things. Let me give you a couple of examples of the development of RFCs. One of them, this happened, I started it in 1994. I was working for a small engineering firm in Santa Barbara called ACC, and we had just we were in the process of implementing an ISDN interface. How many of you know what ISDN is? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, it's an older technology. It's certainly there in 3GPP, but it's older technology. But okay, so at the time we were developing that, and I needed a way to manage it. And so what I did was I posted an email to the equivalent of the IETF list of the time. It was the TCP IP list. And I said, hey, a bunch of us have ISDN implementations and MIBs and this, that, and the other. Would people be willing to post their MIB, give me a pointer to the web page or the document or the whatever it is that describes that MIB, and let us all go look at it? Then we can have a discussion about what a common MIB would look like. I got 8 responses of people that said, yeah, I'd be willing to do that. And then I got a response from a fellow by the name of Günter Roch from Germany, who said, okay, I have looked at all of those, and I have figured out that everybody's doing roughly the same thing. They call them different things, but they're doing roughly the same thing. And I've coalesced all that into a document. And he had done that like in 24 hours. And would you mind, Fred, if I posted that as an internet draft? And it's like, work I don't have to do. This sounds great. And so he posted it, and it became actually 2 RFCs describing the basic ISDN MIB and then a diagnostic MIB. How do I find a problem in an ISDN network? Now, how did that happen? Frankly, it was a collaboration. I had 8 different people with 8 different solutions who posted them. I had a guy who probably had one of them as his own solution in Germany who was willing to do the work. And then we had a discussion, and the discussion took about a year. And then it went to the RFC editor's office and went through their processes. But resulted in an outcome which is in use wherever there's an ISDN network today. It's fairly collegial. Another example is in the secure shell. How many of you use SSH? All of us use SSH all the time. Yes, okay. So the guy that developed that developed something for his own use and just wrote the code and then decided he had people asking him for it. So he put it in open source, let people compile it. And then finally he described it in an internet draft, which he then abandoned. He didn't do anything with the draft until he had started a company and a whole lot of stuff had happened. And so we built what was called Secure Shell 2, and that wound up in a series of RFCs that actually describes the new version of Secure Shell, which there have been issues with getting deployed. Everybody's running Secure Shell 1. His original thing, which was only described in the internet draft. But the reason that he got RFCs was basically that there was interest in having a published version and an open version, not one that was proprietary to his company. So fine, we wound up with an open version of SSH. Another process that we went through was in congestion control in TCP. Now, in the mid-1980s, 1985 to 1987, 56 kilobit NSFnet was a very popular network, and it underwent congestive collapse. Bad things happened. So just before that happened, in 1984, John Nagel, who at the time was an engineer at Philco Ford, was looking for solutions to congestion management, congestion avoidance, came up with what's popularly known as the Nagel option in TCP, and then made a more general comment, realized that there was a fundamental flaw in the design of IP, which was that time to live is actually time. It was measured in seconds. And given the line speeds of the time, he said, well, wait a second, what if somebody actually says, well, don't let my packet wait more than 15 seconds, put the number 15 in time to live, and then the packet sat, a queue depth came into being that was 16 seconds deep. What I would wind up with is a situation in which the line was 100% utilized and achieved zero throughput because all the packets got discarded when they got to the other side. And so we actually experienced that in the 56 kilobit NSFnet. And about that time, a young grad student who you'll find running around here this week by the name of Van Jacobson started playing with that and came up with a solution that was fairly simple, but more or less worked. And he documented that in a paper in SIGCOMM. That started the development of kind of a long series of changes in the RFC series, where we went through and talked about TCP congestion control, talked about congestion in the internet. Come on in, guys. Alice, you too, you're allowed. So, so processes by which things become RFCs vary. But in essence today, what we do is we document the idea in an internet draft, talk about it forever, and then ultimately send it to the RFC editor. So that process with TCP, frankly, there have been a list of other things that have gone on that have been related to that. So the whole quality of service discussion really came out of those same observations and so on. The point to remember, though, is that that entire discussion started with an RFC that was not a standard. It's a white paper. You guys throwing out an observation, throwing out an idea. And that idea engendered discussion and subsequent standards, open source code, so on and so forth, as a result of the observation that the guy made. So now let me talk a little bit about the theory of the IETF. And here, you know, like I say, if you were listening to Scott, you've heard some of this before. So the structure of the IETF, we have areas, and the areas have working groups. And the working groups are managed by the area directors, people in the ISG. We also have the research group, IRTF, and various research groups underneath the IRTF. A number of different organizations that are there basically for the discussion of ideas and the development of, hopefully, working code. When I talk about working group processes, the most important thing in a working group is, what was it we came here to do? The charter. So if I go read the charter for V6 Ops, for the working group that I chair, it tells me that first and foremost, it's a forum for operators to talk about the things that they experience and to make reports and say, you know, I'm seeing good things here and bad things there related to IPv6. Okay, if they come talking about IPv4, it's technically out of charter. It's not something we're supposed to be doing. And so then the next step, obviously, is that they might come up with operational workarounds, and they might want us to go back to other working groups in the IETF and talk about the issues that are coming up. I'll in fact be doing that on Thursday, I believe, in the routing working group, because in the last meeting in Yokohama, a comment was made from the floor that multi-homing under a certain scenario couldn't work unless routing in an enterprise network would get packets to the right upstream ISP. And so the IETF needed to do some work related to routing in terms of making sure that packets get to the right ISP. So that observation is a direct, my charter tells me I'm supposed to do that. And so I wound up writing an email as chair of the working group to some area directors and various working group chairs saying, this is a problem that the operators in my working group say we need to address. Okay, how does work get started in the IETF? That's one way. My working group specifically starts work in the IETF. So the charter tells us what things a working group is allowed to work on, what it's not allowed to work on, gives us some idea of timelines, tells us something about the problem statement for the working group. And then we have, obviously, discussion. If you've been on V6 Ops mailing list at all, we can have long discussions. And we meet at IETF meetings and if needed, between meetings in order to discuss things that need to be discussed. Okay? Whole bunch of just people talking to each other. I had a discussion this morning with a bunch of regulators that are attending this meeting in order to learn about the processes by which the internet is developed. And one of the questions they asked me was, how do you get your projects? And who tells you what to do? And how do you decide when you've chosen a particular thing. And what she was really looking for was, so who's the president of the internet? And it's like, I'm sorry, we don't have one. We talk to each other and we develop a consensus. It's like, oh my goodness, I never would have thought of that one. She's from the government of Peru, so whatever. But yeah, that's what we do in this public discussion, is we discuss things. And we develop, hopefully, a common viewpoint coming out of that, and then we say, okay, let's do that. Now, with any topic, whether it's a working group or whether it's a particular project that we're going to write internet drafts for, the first thing that you want to know about a problem is what the problem is. You'd be amazed how many people come to the IETF and say, I have a solution. I want to work on my solution. Please, can I work on my solution? I had a guy from the Department of Defense once come into another working group that I chaired at the time and basically stomp his feet and say, I need for you to implement this particular algorithm for me. And I asked him, so what problem are you solving? Give me, let's discuss requirements. And he said, the requirement is that you implement my algorithm. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff say that you have to. And he's like, no, I don't care. And that really surprised him, for me to say, 12-star general up there, I don't care what his opinion is. Oh no, you're supposed to salute when they say something, okay? Our first discussion point is always, what problem are we solving? And that has various things. One of the aspects of that is to focus discussion, make sure that we're not just running around all over the map, and then to be able to say that particular part of the solution solves a problem that isn't this one. And be able to say, this particular part is actually not relevant. And then we'll talk about several proposals. Now, I mentioned the ISDN MIB as an example of the development of what became 2 RFCs. And I pointed out that I had 8 input documents, none of which were the direct RFC that eventually got written. Okay? Each of them was a separate proposal. It was what some company was doing in order to figure things out. So I'm going to have usually more than one, sometimes a whole lot of different proposals. And one of the jobs of the working group is to sort through them and say, this is actually not a good solution. These 3 actually are. What do they have in common? Is there a common architecture we can pull out of that? Is there, how do these things fit together? Do they fit together? Maybe they don't. But so in an internet draft, what we're doing is making a suggestion and discussing the ramifications of that suggestion. And the working group is going to now work through that. And maybe it'll adopt it. Very likely it will change it in some way before adopting it. That's quite common. And please don't be upset when it happens. It's the way people work, okay? Because our objective is not to write an RFC. It's to discuss and solve a problem. And so it's all about giving customers, giving operators, giving people that are running whatever application it is, whatever networking aspect it is, giving them good solutions to their problems. So we're obviously going to merge and select proposals and develop a consensus around whatever solution we eventually come up with. Scott, if you were in the previous session, had a slide talked a little bit about intellectual property. One of the things that tends to happen during this discussion of formulating a consensus is that somebody will come out and say, because if we ask them, oh, by the way, here's this thing that I really think you ought to do, And by the way, if you do that, pay me. This is my way of making money. And working groups here quite often say, why don't we do something else? Intellectual property is not forbidden, but it can make discussions harder. Because the working group quite often will step back and say, is there a way that's not encumbered? Is there a way that doesn't have somebody making money as a result? At the end of the day, what we're trying to get to is rough consensus and running code. Rough consensus, let me talk a little bit about what that means. That doesn't mean that everybody in the room agrees. I'd like to have everybody in the room agree. Sometimes there's somebody who just, I'm sorry, he's not going to agree. And the interesting thing with that is that quite often we find that the minority is right. He or she has something that he's looked at and realized, if we all go do this, that bad thing will happen. And so we actually now stop and really listen to that person and say, tell me about that. What is it and why is it that that bad thing is going to happen? And then after we've heard them out, we might make a change to the proposal that we're working on in order to fix whatever it is that we're doing. Or we might say, we actually don't agree that that bad thing will happen. We as a group have discussed it, we've heard you out, we understand your viewpoint, but we disagree. And at that point, that person is obviously still, they don't like the proposal. But the working group is now going to say, so we have rough consensus among everybody except that one or that couple of people. And that's really what we're looking for. We'd like to have full consensus. We will settle for rough consensus, for somebody disagreeing that we've heard out, that we've listened to, that we've convinced ourselves that their point isn't valid, isn't strong enough. What we're really concerned about is we want to know that the proposal, whatever it is that we pick up, demonstrably works. Where is politics in all this? Hey, we're human beings. You put one person in a room and you'll have two opinions. Put two people in a room, they have politics. Politics is here. We really try to make it not be a factor. We really try to make it not be a factor. Now, and this comes back to your question this morning. I get asked from time to time, okay, I've got this wonderful idea. I have a solution that I would like to see adopted. I have something that I want to do. How do I create a working group? How do I create a BOF to go work on that? Where that starts out in the IETF, first we need a set of people that are interested in working on it. If we don't have a set of people that are interested in working on it, we're not going to work on it. Okay? So by the way, these slides are going to be posted somewhere, right? Yeah. So they're available too. So what will usually happen is that we'll have basically an informal meeting that happens. It often happens in a bar, often with alcohol. It's not a formal meeting. It's not something that you go get a room and let's have a marketing presentation for, that kind of a thing. Really not interested in that. A bunch of engineers that happen to be interested in a problem, and let's talk about it. Let's see if we can develop that community, that commonality among people that are working here, in order to go work on that. And that is, of course, going to include a problem statement. You're going to need to describe what problem you think you're solving, and you might have a couple of possible solutions to it. And at that point, what you really want to do, post an internet draft describing that problem, And then start perhaps a mailing list or some other discussion format and get that community talking to itself, talking among itself and saying, you know, here's what I want to do in that environment. Now, once you've built that community, then you go to an area director and say, I have a problem, I have a community, I have discussion that's going on here. It really kind of looks like a working group in the process of formation. And then the area director, assuming that analysis is right, will say, okay, so what you really want to do now is have what we call a working group forming BOF, a birds of a feather session at an IETF meeting, and let's actually agree on the charter formally, and then charter the working group to go do that, figure out what timeline and all that kind of thing. And that discussion you'll find documented on the BOF tracker, which is one of the tools at IETF.org. And we'll form a working group for that. Of course, if they disagree with you, they think that problem's already solved, they think you haven't got an adequate community together, they might have other guidance for you. That's why we have area directors, is to figure that stuff out. But that's basically the process. Okay, the first thing is not to have a bar-BOF. The first thing is to build a community. And a bar-BOF might be part of building that community. But it's about building a community, getting a discussion going, and showing an area director that, okay, we have some valid, viable work that's happening here. Now, an internet draft, some of you might be more familiar with ITU or RFC processes. Many SDOs talk about contributions coming in. And quite often when I look at ITU contributions or other IEEE, other contributions that are submitted to an SDO, Standards Development Organization, sorry. What the contribution says is, I have an interesting problem, I'd like to work on it. No. What we're actually looking for is something more fleshed out that somebody can read and then respond to and have a rational discussion about. So we're looking for a little bit more content in there. That said, an internet draft is not necessarily a work item. If you go through, I happen to have the directory, which I get from you, of all of the internet drafts that have ever been filed since 1992, which is a lot of drafts. I have those on my laptop. I sat down and looked at them. How many of those actually became RFCs? How many of them went through, different steps of the process? And what I found was that half of the internet drafts that were posted were literally documents that people just decided to post. Didn't do anything further with it all. So now think about, once again, I mentioned the ISDN MIB. I had 8 inputs. Okay, those 8 inputs didn't become 8 outputs. They became 2 outputs. Okay, so half of all internet drafts are just documents, and that's all they ever do. They go up, we talk about them, maybe we don't talk about them, they go away. 75% of internet drafts do not become RFCs. Why? Think about the process. Okay, so I get 2 or 3, maybe 8 things that come in, and one of the first things that happens after there's discussion, we coalesce around some kind of a proposal, and that proposal becomes a working group doc. Okay, at that point I change its name. So the things that were before that will never be RFCs. The thing that became a working group doc has a different name, and it might become an RFC. The working group might not actually ultimately publish that. Might say, well, we worked on that a while, and then we decided we're done. We're going to abandon that. That happens. So 75% of internet drafts do not become RFCs. That's okay. And the reason is the things that we send to the RFC editor are for archival purposes. We want to hang on to them. We want to keep them around. And now, why would we want to keep them around? Do you know what the RFC repository is? RFC repository is not a collection of standards. It is not a collection of white papers. It's not a statement about how things ought to work. We have many things in the RFC series that we explicitly say, please don't do that, or we obsoleted it, we're doing something else. What the RFC series is community memory. It allows us to remember the good, the bad, and the ugly, and hopefully in the future, only come up with the good. Okay, it's community memory, what it really is. Okay, now what kinds of drafts do we have? I've already used these terms, but let me formalize that. We have individual submissions, which are simply a draft that somebody chose to write. All it is. If I look at Warren Kumari, decided he wanted to write a draft and describe that in his network, he drops all packets that have been fragmented. So fine, he wrote a draft, which is, the name is Draft Kumari, something about fragmenting packets. It was never submitted to a working group. It eventually got discussed in my working group, but it's just an individual submission. Came to the IETF and he didn't target a working group. Why do people do that? Well, maybe they don't know what working group it should go to in the first place. Maybe they just want to talk about a problem. Maybe they're thinking about building a BOF and building a community around it. The second set of things is individual submissions to a working group. So with the first one is Draft Kumari, and he didn't give me a working group name, so I know that it's just an individual submission. If he'd said Draft Kumari V6 Ops, as working group chair in V6 Ops, I would now pick that up and say, I have somebody who wants to talk about something. And I'd actually send an email to the working group inviting discussion of that document. And if I find there's subsequent discussion, I might put it on an agenda to discuss in an IETF meeting. And then eventually, I might have a working group document come out of that. That's a case where the working group has said, this is a problem we're interested in. The solution is perhaps not perfect, but it's in the general direction of where I want to go. And so now let's go through several steps of refining that and coming up with something that we actually want to save and as an archival thing, as an RFC. And maybe we'd like to see implemented in an internet near us. Okay? So an internet draft, it's a contribution. It's intended to be a substantive contribution, not just I want to talk about something, but here's really what I want to talk about. Here are the issues, here's what I'm trying to describe. It's going to go through a process in a working group, and the internet draft itself will actually expire in 6 months if it's not updated. So if you don't keep it going, working group chairs like me will say, hey, you're done, go away, and have you do something else. Now, I've called an RFC an archival document, and I'm repeating here something I actually said a little bit earlier, that is not necessarily a standard. Often, it's just a white paper. And what it primarily is community memory. I thought this was a cute quote. Experience is that marvelous thing that allows you to recognize a mistake when you make it again. And yes, we do that. We're human beings, and we do that. We have actually a number of different categories of RFCs. Some of them we simply say, let's not do that anymore. We make it historic. So with a routing protocol called the Routing Information Protocol, RIP, RFC 1058. We used that very widely in the internet for a period of time. And then when we changed from having Class A, Class B, Class C addresses to using CIDR prefix management, the RIP protocol, as defined at the time, could no longer work. We basically made it be a protocol you can't deploy. And what we said was, at the time, fine, let's just make that thing go away. We think we have better ideas anyway. OSPF, ISIS, let's tell people to go do those. And we're just going to make RIP go away. So we declared RIP to be historic. Then subsequently, we came up with another RIP version 2 and actually made a standard out of that because we found that our customers really wanted to use RIP. Okay, you know, bad idea, but yeah, okay, we'll make that happen for you. And so we wrote a protocol description for a CIDR, routing information protocol. So certainly we have historic documents, documents that we say, don't do that, okay? We have experimental documents. You could describe the entire internet as an experiment that escaped the lab. We have some documents that are quite literally, this is an experiment. You don't want to do this without touching base with whoever the author of this document is, because he might be doing something different. He might have learned something while this has been going on. And so you'll find actually quite a number of documents that are literally describing experiments. And this is explicitly dangerous territory. We're saying, you know, here's an idea, we want to learn from it. But we aren't yet at the point of saying, we really think everybody ought to do this. Let me give you an example there. ISI in about 1990 to 1992 came up with a transport protocol, something like TCP, but instead of enumerating octets going back and forth or octet packets going back and forth and having acknowledgments for individual packets, would send blocks of packets and then would get a single acknowledgement saying, okay, I got from packets number this to that, I got these and I didn't get those, please retransmit those and maybe send me the next block. We called it, or they called it, NetBlit. Okay, so you'll find some RFCs there that say, here's NetBlit, here's how it works. Written, I think the author is actually Bob Braden, but written by somebody at ISI. And at the end of it, he came back and said, don't do that, bad idea. This doesn't work. And he didn't write an RFC saying, please don't do that. But if you go ask him about it, okay, you were doing an experiment. I think it's a really interesting experiment. Could we experiment with you? He'll say, no, 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 go away. Bad idea, wave off, okay? So we have historic documents, we have experimental documents, we have a lot of white papers. So I mentioned John Nagel's RFC 970 on packet switches with infinite storage, talking about congestion avoidance and developing first this whole concept of fair queuing or class-based queuing. And you know, those aren't standards. They're not telling anybody what to do or how to do it. They're informational, and we call them that. Okay. Now, among standards, we used to have 3 levels in a standards track. Now we have 2. The first one, we have a document coming out of a working group, and we want to say, we think this works. All of our experience so far says this works. Give it a whirl. Tell us if it works. And if it doesn't work, okay, we'll change it. We'll do whatever it is we need to do to change it. But then after we've used it for a while, then we might say we want to move it from proposed standard to standard or internet standard. To be perfectly honest, the internet runs on proposed standards. There's most of the documents that you read that are standards, you'll find are proposed standards. And we have a process that we go through to kind of clean that up and say, this actually works, please do this. And we're going through that in the 6-man working group right now with IPv6. RFC 2460 is at proposed standard. And we're going through and saying, we actually want to call that standard because we haven't changed it in approximately forever. And it works. So please just do that. And so you'll find that we have an internet draft. The title is 2460 bis. And what we're actually doing in that is removing things that are in 2460 that nobody implemented or that we decided didn't work, just removing those. And then the outcome of that, we want to say, this works. Okay? So that will be at what we call standard. We also have process documents. Hi, Scott. So Scott's going to correct me on this, by the way. We have process documents where we go through and say, we think people should do this. And sometimes we're wrong, and we're willing to say, let's not do that. But usually we've thought this through pretty well. We have a pretty good notion of why we're recommending it and what one might want to do with that. So, for example, we have a document which is RFC 2827. Second name for the same document is BCP 38. BCP 38 says if you're a service provider, you're offering service to a customer, customer has some set of IPv4 or IPv6 prefixes that you know that he's using. And if he sends you packets that don't have those source addresses, he's probably attacking somebody. Please make them go away. Just drop those packets, okay? And so that we call a best current practice. Sometimes they're best proposed practices, but okay. So now this is not something that we're going to go through. There's a proposed standard and then later it becomes internet standard. It's just what we think people ought to do. And the fact that we think people ought to do it, we call that a best current practice. So what's an RFC? It's community memory. It's remembering our mistakes. It's remembering the things we did right and providing then guidance to service providers, to people to write code, to whoever it is that it targets. Now, I told you I was going to talk about theory. Okay, now, both Einstein and Yogi Berra are quoted, attributed to the quote that in theory and practice are the same thing. In practice, they sometimes differ. And okay, so practice in the IETF sometimes differs from theory. If I think about the IETF process, it depends very heavily on goodwill, on people acting in a principled and objective manner, and doing good planning and being consistent in what they do. If you look at the job of a working group chair, you want that guy to be, or that girl, that person, to be predictable. You give them a good proposal, they're going to do something good with it, whatever that is. But you're depending on people. People have all sorts of faults, and those particular areas tend to be the things that characterize us, okay? That happens in the IETF as well. You're dealing with people, and people are not perfect. Would that it were otherwise, but like other issues that we deal with in the IETF, we generally resolve that in discussion. And we will do it by bringing up the problem, by talking about the problem. And if the problem is literally a person, we have a recall process. We might literally recall an area director or somebody like that. Or it might be that a person who's responsible, maybe an area director, takes care of several working groups. You have a working group that isn't functioning correctly. The area director might come say, I need to change this working group chair. working group chair similarly works with internet draft authors and makes judgment calls about what's going on with internet drafts. Generally speaking, we will have a discussion and figure out what it is we want to do with that. I actually have a situation like that in V6 Ops. Right now, we're going to have a discussion about it tomorrow. And the deal is that we have a particular internet draft, and the authors really think their draft is important. They want it to become an RFC, and they want it to result in changes to a protocol, to IPv6. And, okay, they have a consensus around that viewpoint. I have another set of people in the same working group that think that the problem is essentially operational. That, well, if you wouldn't configure your equipment that way, if you configure it the way we told you to, you wouldn't have that problem. Don't do that. I have another set of people that are looking at it yet a third way. And so when I'm talking with the authors of the document, they're kind of saying, you know, Fred, I don't think you're operating according to the working group charter. I think you're not accomplishing what you should do with my draft. When I put it in the context of these different focuses of opinion, then it looks very different. Okay, so tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, we're actually going to have a discussion where I've got 3 different viewpoints in the room, and you guys fight. You know, you guys duke it out. Tell me what's going on and what the right outcome should be. So we do have a real problem. We know that there's a problem. The question is, what's the right solution? So when we're dealing with issues along these lines, generally speaking, we will find the outcome gets fixed by talking about it and just surfacing all the issues. Okay. Let me tell you about me just a little bit. I have a number of internet drafts in the mill right now. Some of these will become RFCs, some of them probably won't. Okay? One of them is in your inbox. Now, if you ever have that number of RFCs with your name on them, you're crazy. Let me tell you, as someone who does, that's a lot of work. Okay? Typically, an IETFer will have 1 or 2 or 3 that they're working on, or a set of them together. These are actually, you can see if you look at the names, I've got one in ISIS, I've got one in a BOF, I've got one in V6 Ops, I've got one in the Ops Area Working Group, I've got 2 in 6-man, 2 in AQM, 1 in OSPF, 1 in T. I'm a busy boy, okay? And seriously, this is not an objective. If what you're doing leads you in that direction, go for it. You have my sympathy. But this is not an objective. This is what can happen. In V6 Ops, right now, I have 2 documents that are in the process of being worked on by the RFC editor, and will if my co-author ever responds to the RFC editor, one of them will become an RFC right then. 2 of them are involved in IETF, IESG discussion. 4 of them are actually working group drafts, and I have another 7 individual submissions that have come into the working group because somebody wanted to talk about whatever that topic was. What we've actually done with those, 4 of these individual submissions, we've shifted to Sunset 4, a different working group. And the thing was that we actually invited those documents, and then there was a discussion between 2 working groups, and Sunset 4 chairs came back to V6 Ops and said, we think that work should go on in our working group. Okay, shifted the work off to them. We have 1 submission that has no discussion. Nobody said that they're interested in it. If nobody's interested in it, I'm not going to put it on an agenda. We have 2 others that are on the agenda tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so looking at V6 Ops through the eyes of a working group chair, we always have kind of a variety of things moving through the working group. And a number of different discussions. So expect that that's likely to happen in whatever working group you're working in. And understand that the chair, unless they're just really a bad chair, the chair is trying to make the right thing happen for your draft. The right thing might be to kill it. The right thing might be to say, this draft isn't going anywhere. Or they might be to say, I need to merge this with this other draft, and by the way, I have a comment on the mailing list that says, and you've got to do some other things as well. And I'd like to pull that together into a common draft that actually addresses more of the problem. Or there might be other outcomes. But this is what your working group chair is generally dealing with and is trying to make something happen. So when you're sitting there kind of saying, I posted my draft, where's my RFC number? That's what's going on. So welcome to the IETF. This is the process that we go through. Now, where are we with respect to time? Got 5 minutes. Okay, good. I've got about 5 minutes worth of additional slides. Why am I involved in the IETF? Why have I been here for 27 years? Yes, I've been here 27 years. I'm here to make a difference, and I'll bet each of you is here the same way. I want to make the internet be a better place, want to improve things for my customers. If I can improve things for my customers, I expect they might buy my equipment. Okay, yes, there's a commercial thought in the back of my head, but I'm not here to sell my equipment. I'm here to make things better for my customers and expect that as a result, they might buy my equipment. And who is the IETF? First and foremost, we're a community. We're a set of people. And you'll find that many of us know each other's spouses, our friends on Facebook, talk back and forth, and that crosses company boundaries. I have a number of friends that work at Huawei. I have a number of friends that work at Juniper. Our companies are deadly enemies. We're not, okay? Engineers, at the end of the day, if you want to have an interoperable network and have customers be able to go build solutions out of your products, they have to be interoperable. Engineers have to talk to each other. That's just a very important part, okay? So, yeah, we're a community. And sometimes we can be a little hard to get along with. I'm sorry, that's just true. But think about, so how do you make a difference in your community at home? In your neighborhood, you can make it a better neighborhood, you can make it a worse neighborhood by how much trash you leave in your yard, by how late you stay up with loud music on. How do you deal with your neighbors? Frankly, the things that you do at home to make a difference in your community are the same things that you want to do here. You want to be constructive, you want to make useful comments, you want to make proposals that make sense, and essentially work toward that goal of making the internet be a better place. People talk about the old boys network. I am probably the definitive old boy. If it's not me, then Scott, who was in this room an hour ago, is a definitive old boy. What you'll find, I think, is that there is not really an old boys network in the negative sense of that term. What there are is people who have developed relationships and people that we haven't developed relationships yet with, okay, which might be you. And how do you go develop a relationship with somebody? Well, you might start out by talking with them. You might start out by making constructive comments on their documents or asking them for thoughts about yours. Essentially, the people that get listened to in the IETF are people with clue, people that work productively in the community environment, come up with solutions that actually solve people's problems. And the community can be very generous toward people that have that kind of a history and can be very tough on people that don't, okay? And that's just a fact. and that's dealing with human beings as much as anything else. So, looking at the question, I filed my internet draft, where's my RFC number? I just, in the last hour, I updated this slide an hour before this meeting, went through the internet draft directory and counted how many active internet drafts we have. We have 2,140 active internet drafts. And you know what? I have not read them all. Believe it or not, I have not read them all. If you want to get a working group and a working group chair attention on your draft, an important thing first is to actually name it properly. Okay, I'm going to look for things that have the word V6 Ops right there. Why? I'm the V6 Ops chair. That's my job. And if you name it improperly, if you make it, draft Kumari, I'm worried about fragmentation, I might not even realize it's there. Okay, very honestly, and maybe this is a bad thing, but it's a true thing. I may not even look at it because it doesn't say, and Fred, this belongs in your working group. Okay? So name your working group draft, or name your draft for whatever it is you want to have happen with it. If you want it to be discussed in a particular working group, put the name of the working group in it. And then whatever you do with it, even if it's just an individual submission, send an email to the mailing list for that group saying, I have this new draft and I'd be interested in people's comments on it. Guess what? You will probably get comments. And that's kind of how things start, how things go. So with that, we probably got 30 seconds left, but okay, what's the question? Okay. Listening to Meet Echo. Lorenzo Maniero, do you have something that you wanted to say? Okay, I'm not hearing anything from Meet Echo. Okay, comments in the room? Anybody? Did we not get a blue sheet?
They're not blue sheets for tutorials. Blue sheets are only for working group sessions.
We don't do that for tutorials.
It's because it's official. It has to do with Note Well. It doesn't have to do with tutorial.
Okay.
For the mentoring program, it'll help me out a lot. And then, of course, if you guys would like to be a part of the mentoring program, get a mentor. Fred is mentoring 2 people right now. So if you want a great guy like Fred, hang out with him.
So here is one of my previous mentees.
Exactly. This is Nabil Ben Amar from Morocco. I'm ISOC fellow here for the IETF, my 3rd fellowship. In my previous one, I have been mentored by Fred Becker, one of the fathers of internet. So my question is, how can you be the working group chair and making drafts within this working group? Is it a normal process in the IETF?
How do you write a draft in your own working group? And that's something that you have to be careful with as a working group chair. It's a question of kind of what hat you're wearing. So now from 1996 to 2001, I was the IETF chair, and I was also writing drafts in a couple or 3 different working groups. So now I was actually in a position of reviewing drafts and being able to say, working group chair, you did the wrong thing. And that actually is very dicey. Yeah, you would not want me saying that in that situation because that's a conflict of interest. Okay, so how do I write a draft in V6 Ops? I have a co-chair. And I tell my co-chair, for this draft, you are the chair. I will not act as chair with respect to this draft. Okay.
And I believe they have the newcomers meet and greet for, where is it? 8:30? Yeah, 8th floor. And then if you have an individual mentor assigned and you have not met him yet, him or her, then please come to the mentoring table. Or if you would like a mentor, or if you just want to come and say hello, then, come over and you can meet your mentor there. Thank you all so much for your time.